Good afternoon. Thank you for attending the second in a series of public dialogues sponsored by UC Santa Barbara and with the generous support of the John Templeton Foundation. These dialogues are part of a 3-year program at UCSB titled New Visions of Nature, Science, and Religion. Further information is available from our website, www.newvisions.ucsb.edu. There is also a sign-up sheet available in the back for our email announcement list. My name is Jim Proctor. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography, which is co-sponsoring today's event along with UCSB's Psychology Department and its new Mind Science initiative. Our two distinguished guests are Evan Thompson, Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Science and the Embodied Mind, and member of the Department of Philosophy at York University, Toronto. Welcome, Evan. And Frans de Waal, C.H. Candler, Professor of Primate Behavior in the Department of Psychology at Emory University, Atlanta. Frans, welcome. Evan's broad background spans Asian studies, cognitive science, and phenomenological philosophy. His books bear provocative titles including The Embodied Mind and Why the Mind Isn't in the Head. Evan visited UC Santa Barbara 3 years ago as a distinguished lecturer in our Science, Religion, and the Human Experience series. At the conclusion of his talk, Evan stated, quote, "Certain contemplative/wisdom traditions and certain approaches in science are not simply compatible, but mutually informative and enlightening. Through back-and-forth circulation, each approach can reshape the other, leading to new conceptual and practical understandings for both." Frans de Waal is probably known to many of you for his highly regarded and highly readable books exploring parallels between primates and people, such as Good-Natured, The Origins of Right and Wrong in Humans and Other Animals, The Ape and the Sushi Master, Cultural Reflections of a Primatologist, and My Family Album, 30 Years of Primate Photography, some of which you've seen. I'd like to quote for you his conclusion to The Ape and the Sushi Master. "The time has come to define the human species against the backdrop of the vast common ground we share with other life forms. Instead of being tied to how we are unlike any animal, human identity should be built around how we are animals that have taken certain capacities a significant step farther. We and other animals are both similar and different, and the former is the only sensible framework within which to flesh out the latter." The quotes of Frans and Evan I've just read suggest why we have invited them to visit UCSB as part of a program on nature, science, and religion. As the Brain Earth image suggests, the New Visions program considers nature as not just mountains and trees and birds and monkeys, but also human nature as possibly linked with biophysical nature in ways we are only beginning to understand. The work of Frans de Waal is a prime example of recent research suggesting important continuities between biophysical and human nature. But the whole question of what is nature in this broader sense has been central to both scientific and religious traditions. And here too we find recent theories, such as those of Evan Thompson, suggesting that there may be overlap. So in Frans de Waal and Evan Thompson, we've covered two major axes in our New Vision program, spanning biophysical and human nature and science and religion. But Frans and Evan come from quite different academic backgrounds. So what is the common basis for today's dialogue? Well, I've offered one in the pictures to the upper right, a Capuchin monkey and a Capuchin monk, in this case, Father Pierre Benoit, famous for saving many Jews in France and Rome, Italy, from the Holocaust. Today's dialogue will not, at least as far as I know, concern similarities between Capuchin monks and monkeys. But Evan and Frans will explore similarities in their research and what it tells us about the nature of the human mind. And given that we are gathering here just one day before February 14th, it seems only natural, I'd say, that our theme have something to do with the special capacity of the human mind. Some would locate this capacity in the heart, and of course that is love. Well, indeed, in the broad sense of empathy, such as that exemplified by Father Benoit, love is very much a common feature of the research of Evan Thompson and Frans de Waal. So here, from two rather different disciplinary points of departure, primates, monks, and the mind becomes an overlapping terrain for Frans and Evan to explore with us. We will commence with introductory remarks by Evan and then by Frans. Then I will allow a brief period in which you may come to one of the two mics in front and ask questions of our distinguished guest scholars, following which I will facilitate a dialogue and then follow-up question and answer session. With this background, I will now turn to our distinguished guests, Evan Thompson and Frans de Waal. We are very pleased for you to join us today, and we will start with an introductory talk by Evan Thompson.
Get my PowerPoint up here. There we go. Well, thank you, Jim. It's a great pleasure to be back in Santa Barbara, and especially to escape my home city of Toronto, where it's very cold and snowy at the moment. And it's a little disconcerting because I can't actually see you very well, so if I look a little disoriented at times, don't take it personally, it's the lights in my eyes. The title of my remarks is Exploring Consciousness Towards a Phenomenological Cognitive Science of the Contemplative Mind and Brain. It's a long and wordy title, but I hope its meaning will become clearer to you as I proceed. And since our theme for today is primates, monks, and the mind, I would like to begin with two passages, anecdotes that I'm especially fond of, that come from very different times and places. The first is a Song Dynasty poem by a poet named Zhi Yuan, who was the abbot of Mao Nao Monastery, a Buddhist monastery. And he wrote a poem called In Praise of Chan Master Wang Yo, who cares for the bonnet monkeys around his mountain studio. From tree after tree in the undisturbed courtyard, the fruits dropped on the frost. They even love entering the thatched hall to listen to Dharma. How is it other species know courtesy and limits? Coming in each time, they sit opposite one another on the meditation benches. And this is from an anthology, wonderful anthology called The Cloud Should Know Me by Now, Buddhist Poet Monks of China. The second passage is from an article by the primatologist Barbara Smuts called Encounters with Animal Minds. And she recounts the following experience. One experience I especially treasure. The Gombe baboons were traveling to their sleeping trees late in the day, moving slowly downstream with many small still pools, a route they often traversed. Without any signal perceptible to me, each baboon sat at the edge of a pool on one of the many smooth rocks that line the edges of the stream. They sat alone or in clusters, completely quiet, gazing at the water. Even the perpetually noisy juveniles fell into silent contemplation. I joined them. Half an hour later, again with no perceptible signal, they resumed their journey in expression of what I have come to think of as baboon sangha. Sangha is the word in Sanskrit for the Buddhist community. Although I've spent years with baboons, I've witnessed this only twice, both times at Gombe. I have never heard another primatologist recount such an experience. Sometimes I wonder if, on those two occasions, I was granted a glimpse of a dimension of baboon life they do not normally expose to people. These moments reminded me of how little we really know about the more than human world. Now, these passages are, both the poem and this passage are very rich and suggestive, I think. They contain within them the following ideas. First of all, that contemplative experience, contemplation, might be available to other animals besides human beings. Secondly, that the capacity for contemplative mental states is part of our biological heritage. Such states may reflect distinct and very much largely unknown to us now, distinct sorts of brain activity and physiological processes of the whole body, a quieting of the whole organism in contemplation. And thirdly, contemplative experience may be shareable between species. And this seems to be a way of relating to the living world that is largely lost or foreign to our modern Western way of life. Now, I'm not going to be talking about all of these today. What I want to focus on is the second idea, that the capacity for contemplative mental states is part of our biological heritage, that it belongs to us as living beings, and that such states may reflect something distinct and important about how the brain and the body work. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, the approach that I'm going to take is one that could be called neurophenomenology. This is a term that was introduced by the late neuroscientist Francisco Varela, who I worked with for many years. And the basic idea behind neurophenomenology is the possibility of developing a science of the mind that's not simply or merely experimental, but also experiential, in that it makes use of the first-person perspective, our first-person experience as subjective, as beings with a subjective mental life. And the core idea of neurophenomenology is to bring a phenomenological level of investigation into the science of the mind, into so-called cognitive science, and to have these two approaches, one first person or first person and second person, experiential, and the other third person, where one's concerned with accounts of the brain and behavior, physiology of the organism, to bring these two accounts into a mutually complementary relationship where they can inform each other and constrain each other in a back and forth circular manner of mutual enlightenment. So this is the perspective that is going to be informing what I'm going to be presenting in my remarks today. Now, where I want to start from is a problem that faces the science of the mind today, an outstanding problem for cognitive science, particularly in recent years where cognitive science has become interested in consciousness and subjectivity, subjective experience. So the issue is, how can we study and investigate consciousness or first-person subjective experience in relation to the brain and the body? We're not simply interested in third-person biobehavioral processes, but also in the first-person perspective that is present. So how can we study this? Well, at a minimal approach, we need to rely on first-person reports about subjective experience. So the first-person perspective is essential. It's unavoidable. It's essential, we could say, epistemologically. It's essential as a way of gaining cognitive access or knowledge of the subject matter that we're interested in, which is consciousness or subjectivity. And it's methodologically essential because we need to rely on what people tell us about their experience, on first-person reports. Now, this is actually an old idea in psychology, going back through Gestalt psychology and introspectionist psychology and William James' writings on the stream of consciousness. So this is not a new idea by any means, but it's one that's only recently been recognized and accorded the importance it deserves in cognitive science, largely as a result of the fact that cognitive science grew out of the behaviorist reaction against the earlier experientially based approaches such as introspection and introspectionist psychology and James's writings. So the important point here is that the first-person perspective is essential. But now there's a problem, in the first instance, a kind of methodological problem, which is that naive first-person reports, spontaneous first-person reports about experience, are known to psychologists to be subject to various kinds of biases, such as retrospective reconstruction or trying to explain one's experience rather than strictly describe it, to give some kind of causal account rather than a descriptive one, which introduces various biases, or having to rely on some kind of higher order metacognitive mental activity to monitor one's experience, but that then can interfere with the ongoing process of experiencing. So this is kind of a, you could say, phenomenological or experiential analog of a kind of measurement problem. Then in attempting to gain access to something or measure it or monitor it, you change it. So these are, in the first instance, methodological problems that face the science of the mind when it turns to study consciousness or subjective experience. Now, what I want to propose is that in order to deal with this problem, we need to take some steps beyond the minimal approach. And what I would propose, and this is an idea that's important to neurophenomenology, is that cognitive science needs to work with more refined first-person methods of mental training, of the sort we see in contemplative traditions, for instance, so that first-person reports can be based on a skillful familiarity with mental life rather than simply a casual inspection. So the important idea here is that first-person experience is something that's not simply, although in a way it's available to us in an immediate way because it's the basis of everything, you could say, still to attend to it in a careful, precise manner is not something that's spontaneously available to us. It's something that needs some work. It's a kind of skill that needs to be developed. Now, by first-person methods, what I mean are disciplines for increasing sensitivity to one's experience through training of attention, emotion regulation, awareness of experience from moment to moment, or metacognition. Contemplative traditions work with experience in this first-person way and make use of various kinds of disciplined first-person practices. So contemplative practices of mental training are exemplary in this respect. Now, just to give you a kind of map that I think is useful, especially for psychologists. I think I have a pointer here. We can think of first-person methods as having various dimensions. First of all, a dimension that ranges from, say, the naive beginner, naive first-person reports, to a master or an adept, someone who has an acute phenomenological sensitivity. So that's one dimension. Another dimension is a temporal dimension, where one can give an immediate self-report of the sort that we often see in various kinds of psychology experiments, or one can give reports based on recall at a later time, which we also see in various kinds of psychology experiments that involve using journals and so on. Then another third dimension is what we could call a second-person dimension, where there's a second person who is mediating, who's facilitating this process of more informed attention to and descriptive reports about experience. And this second-person perspective also ranges from a naive perspective to a more expert one, for instance, of the sort we see in, say, clinical psychology, where people are trained in very precise manners of questioning. Another example that's an interesting one of a second-person method is hypnosis, which has been used in a number of neuroscientific experiments to dissociate, for instance, the sensory aspect of pain from the affective aspect, where people under hypnosis are able to dissociate these things. So the second perspective involves a kind of empathetic mediation on the part of a second person. So we have these various dimensions, and within these dimensions we can locate different sorts of techniques or practices that work with experience. Now, in Western cognitive science, most of what's been done in the investigations has really been in this corner here. That is, naive subjects reporting to phenomenologically naive cognitive scientists, working at a very basic level of investigation of experience. And what I would like to propose is that by introducing the perspective that is fostered in contemplative traditions, we have the possibility of taking in much more of this space, involving all three of these dimensions, from someone who's very skilled in attention or mindfulness to experience from moment to moment, working with someone who's trained in that tradition in a second-person way to facilitate the process, also working with Western scientists and psychologists to facilitate this process, and involving various different kinds of protocols in which there could be different time scales or time delays involved. So this is then a full picture of, or a sketch of what I would take the full first-person, second-person perspective to encompass. Okay, so let me just mention a few reasons from the scientist's point of view why this would be interesting. The first is that in using first-person methods, there's the possibility of gaining access to aspects of experience that would otherwise remain unnoticed. So, for instance, fluctuations in the character of attention or affective state from moment to moment. Secondly, this, I'm thinking now really from the point of view of neuroscience, this can help experimenters to gain, to understand processes, physiological processes that would otherwise remain opaque. So in brain imaging experiments, for instance, there's quite a bit of variability in what the brain is doing from moment to moment, and it's natural to think that this has to do with spontaneous fluctuations in mental activity from moment to moment. In most experiments, we don't keep a record of these things. This is starting to change a little bit in cognitive neuroscience, but really we don't keep a precise account of the way that someone's experience changes from moment to moment or second to second in an experiment in which he's doing the same thing repeatedly. And it's natural to think that if we had that richer detail that would come from more precise attention, it could be used, and in fact in some experiments has been used, to make intelligible aspects of the brain processes that would otherwise simply be treated as noise. And then finally, and this is something I'm going to talk about, is that it provides a route into studying the causal efficacy of mental activities, of volitional mental activities, in which there's an intentional component involved. And I want to spend some time talking about that in my remarks. And in order to do that, I'm going to propose that individuals who can generate specific sorts of mental states and report on those states with a high degree of phenomenological precision provide a route into studying the causal efficacy of mental processes. That is, how mental states may modify the structure and dynamics of the brain and body over time. All right, now I'm going to eventually give you an example of a study, but in order to do that, I want to give you a little bit of background to some of the theoretical ideas that lie behind this study. In cognitive science and in neuroscience, there's been the emergence of a dynamical approach, which looks at large-scale dynamical patterns of activity in the brain. And from this point of view, it's natural to hypothesize that a volitional mental state is a dynamic and global systemic feature of the whole brain, and that it emerges when there is a large-scale coherence of many different things going on in the brain, of local and distributed neuronal activities, and that this large-scale pattern globally shapes and constrains what the local activities are in particular regions or in areas of the brain. So this is in very general terms, a kind of hypothesis about volitional mental states from this dynamical approach. Now let me just give you a picture so that you can visualize this idea of dynamic large-scale integration. So we have the brain with frontal and parietal and occipital areas which are involved in different kinds of processes from attention and working memory and vision and so on. And in order for there to be a unified moment of experience, a coherent moment of experience on a time scale of, say, 500 milliseconds to a second, these activities need to be coordinated. They need to be brought together and held together transiently. So I don't know if these arrows are showing up, but the idea is that they need to coordinate their activity. And one plausible view about what this requires is a kind of synchronization of neural activities across and within a number of different frequency bands. The idea being that neural activity involves different rhythms, different oscillatory rhythms, and one way that these mental states may emerge and hold together is through the synchronization of activities within and across these different frequency bands. So it's a kind of, it's like the wave in a stadium in a sporting event. It's the idea that activity starts locally and propagates, and a large pattern develops that coordinates what the many distributed individual systems or areas or neurons are doing. Now, in the case of volition, the hypothesis then would be that in generating a volitional state, large-scale brain activity shifts from one coherent pattern to another, and in doing so entrains local processes, or sort of sucks them into a kind of global pattern, a self-organized pattern of activity. And so, from this point of view, generating a mental state, and we'll see examples in a minute, is a way of intervening at a global level so as to affect local changes. So you could think of this as volition as a way of mobilizing and channeling brain activity in which we have the global pattern dependent, arising from the local, but also constraining it. And as a result of this so-called reciprocal causality of local to global, the whole system moves in a kind of system causation from one state to another. And generating a mental state is one way in which the system moves like this. All right, so now I want to give you an example to try and make some of these very abstract ideas a little bit more concrete. And the example is courtesy of Antoine Lutz and Richie Davidson, who are at the Keck Laboratory in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and their work is also made possible by the Mind and Life Institute. And what you see here is a picture of a Buddhist monk with multiple electrodes over the scalp to record the electrical brain activity. And this study is a published study, which you can look at the details of, recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the title of the study was Long-Term Meditators Self-Induce High-Amplitude Gamma Synchrony During Mental Practice. So gamma is a particular frequency range of oscillatory activity from, say, roughly 25 to 40 hertz and cycles per second. And synchrony is the idea that there is a precise temporal relationship between the phases of the oscillatory activity. And what this study shows is that in long-term Buddhist practitioners, that there are distinctive high-amplitude patterns of gamma oscillations and phase synchrony during the generation of a particular meditative state that one doesn't see in the control subjects who are inexperienced meditators. So let me say a little bit more about that. So first, let me say something about this word meditation. The most general sense we can give this term for our purposes is a process of familiarization with one's own mental life that leads, ideally, to long-lasting changes in cognition and emotion. Beneficial changes to cognition and emotion, such as more stable attention and more wholesome emotional states. This requires mental training and implies then that attention, emotion regulation, and metacognition, or awareness of mental events, that these are flexible skills that can be trained. Now, in the case of this particular study, the kind of meditation that was examined was so-called objectless meditation, and this is a central aspect of the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And in this study, a particular form of this meditation was practiced, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, in general, the idea of an objectless meditation is a meditative state in which one isn't directly attending to a specific object, but rather cultivating a state of being or a certain quality of mind. Doing so in such a way that the object-oriented aspect, that is where you, instead of focusing on a particular sound, if it was a mantra, or focusing on the breath, or focusing on a person, if it's a compassion meditation, which is, in this case, what it's going to be, cultivating the state of being in such a way that the object-oriented aspect of experience appears to dissipate, and the dissipation is achieved by letting the meditative activity become the sole content of the experience without focusing on particular objects. Now, this particular meditation that this study was concerned with was a so-called objectless loving-kindness and compassion meditation. The way that practitioners describe this meditation in these traditions is, first of all, a process of generating from a deep-rooted empathy, that is, an understanding of the emotional predicaments of others, a process of generating from deep-rooted empathy an all-pervading altruistic concern for the well-being and suffering of others. This is central to the Mahayana Buddhist traditions in general. But in the case of this meditation, the focus is not on a particular object or person or being, but is rather objectless. That is, the compassion is meant to be pure in the sense of not being referential, a generation of a pure mental state of loving kindness and compassion that isn't targeted towards any particular individual. Now, in the beginning stages of practice, nevertheless, one has to start by generating compassion for particular persons or groups of beings. They're the anchor point, in a way, for generating this feeling. Yet, ideally, according to this tradition, when this loving kindness and compassion pervades one's whole being, then when one is in this state and is confronted with a particular object or a particular being, really, feelings of loving kindness or compassion and actions for the benefit of others can readily arise, can become spontaneous and natural. All right, now in this study by Lutz and Davidson, I want to emphasize the following points. First of all, the study is highly unusual because it's working from a phenomenological, that is experiential, precise experiential specification of a distinct subjective mental state that's cultivated by Buddhist mental training. In the study, 8 long-term Buddhist practitioners, and long-term means anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 hours of practice over 15 to 40 years. The study was looking at 8 of such individuals compared to control subjects, who are 10 students with no prior meditative experience, and they underwent training for 1 week and practiced for 1 hour a day. The way the study was designed was a block design where you had 30 seconds of resting activity followed by 60 seconds of generating the meditative state, and this happened 4 times sequentially in both the long-term practitioners and the controls. While this was going on, the resting activity and the meditative state, the brain activity, the electrical activity of the scalp, which reflects underlying activity in the brain, was being recorded in the EEG, electroencephalogram. And a time frequency analysis was performed on the electrical activity, where one's interested in the frequency patterns over time and the phase synchrony relationships. So this is just to give you an image for the block design. We have a neutral state, the generation of the meditation state, followed by the neutral state 4 times. How am I doing for time? I've lost all sense of time.
30 minutes.
Okay, so we're getting there. Now, the main finding of the study was that in the long-term practitioners, there was a distinct high amplitude pattern of oscillatory activity in this particular frequency range, the gamma band, which is known to be associated with attention, working memory, various kinds of cognitive processes. So these patterns were particularly high in amplitude, among the largest amplitudes seen in non-pathological subjects, plus distinct long-distance phase synchrony patterns. These are these patterns where the phase of the oscillatory activity has a precise temporal relationship over many distributed regions and areas. And this characterized the generation of this meditative state in the long-term practitioners compared to the controls. There were a number of other differences that I can't go into for lack of time, but you can find out about those if you look at the study. All right, so the study then suggests that during this meditative state, there is the emergence of large-scale distributed neural assemblies or ensembles, many, many different neural systems coordinating their activities, synchronized in a very precise temporal manner in these fast frequencies. And this is indicated by the phase synchrony relationship and the high amplitude oscillatory activity. The study provides a neurodynamical correlate of a subjective mental state that's generated on the basis of first-person methods of mental training. The findings are consistent with the idea that attention and affective processes, particularly ones involving empathy, compassion, loving-kindness, that these are flexible mental skills that can be trained. It has to be said, nevertheless, that further study is needed to know whether these brain signatures that are distinctive of the long-term practitioners, whether these are actually brought about, caused by the long-term training itself, as opposed to or not by individual differences before the training. And this is something that a study of this sort can't establish. You need to have longitudinal studies where you look at the effects of training over the course of a lifetime, ideally, but over a course of some span of time. So let me summarize all of the things that I've been saying to try and draw them together for our purposes today. First of all, fundamental idea is that to investigate experience and its biological basis, the first-person perspective is essential. It's unavoidable. Secondly, for cognitive science to make rigorous use of the first-person perspective, it needs to work with individuals skilled in mental training. Thirdly, contemplative practices of mental training are exemplary for their rigor and their precision, their pragmatic rigor and precision, also their theoretical background. There's a rich, in the case of Buddhism, there's a rich phenomenology and you could say theoretical psychology that informs these practices. The moral then, or the implication, is that contemplative practice and phenomenology can become a research partner for investigating experience and its biological basis, for investigating contemplative experience as part of our, or the capacity for it, let's say, as part of our biological heritage. And a neurophenomenological investigation, this idea of a reciprocal, mutually informing partnership between phenomenology, contemplative practice, and contemplative psychology and cognitive science, that a neurophenomenological investigation of contemplative mental states and their relation to the brain might cast some light on intentional mental causation and its biological basis. And I've really only hinted at this idea in the study where you have the generation of the volitional generation of a particular mental state and the observed neurodynamical correlate, which involves this large-scale pattern of activity that affects what's going to go on in any individual area or or local system in the brain, or in the cortex at any rate. So the future direction then, and I'm coming to the end now, that's proposed by this approach that I've just really sketched in the barest of outlines is the idea of a collaborative research between scientists and expert contemplatives. And this is a picture taken from Richie Davidson's lab, in which the Tibetan Buddhist monks are engaged in the conducting the experiment itself. The image is meant to suggest that what's important from a neurophenomenological point of view is not simply that there are new guinea pigs to put in brain scanners, new contemplative guinea pigs, but rather that this tradition is a rich tradition of experience and mental practice that can play a collaborative role in designing experiments, in interpreting the results, in bringing new taxonomies of mental states and mental events, bringing a rich theoretical perspective on consciousness to play a partnership role with science. And I want to mention two just important institutions, one of which is in Santa Barbara, so I thought it would be nice to mention that, and that's the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies, which is very much trying to promote and is involved in this kind of work. And then the Mind and Life Institute, which has facilitated this work, so if you're interested in this, you can find out more about it from the websites. And to end, I want to leave you with these images. The primates are monkeys that I photographed on the balcony of my room when I was in Dharamsala, India, in October for a meeting on neuroplasticity and mental training with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his community of monks and a number of Western scientists. And the monks are also from the study, as well as the study I mentioned, as well as other studies that are ongoing in Richie Davidson's lab. And here you can see them fitted with the EEG nets that record the electrical brain activity. So I think I've gone enough time, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Evan. France Duvall will come on now. Gee, Evan, for a Sunday afternoon, that talk required a bit of mental activity. We'll have some questions, and you'll get a chance to ask him questions soon. But now I'd like to introduce France Duvall.
Macaques. Yep. Well, I will give a very different talk. Let me see. How do I get out of this? Because I cannot ask my animals introspective questions. Which has disadvantages. But people tend to lie often. And so I don't trust people. Okay, let me see. That's it. Okay. Homo homini lupus. The topic of my talk is the evolution of morality, and I will get into empathy, which is the shared, sort of the common ground between us. But I want to broaden the issue to the issue of whether we are naturally moral or not naturally moral. And of course, the Homo homini lupus saying, which is very popular in many fields of science, law, economics, and so on, is an insult to wolves. Because wolves are very cooperative animals. But I think it's also a misjudgment of our species. We are a very sociable species. And so in biology, we have this view of ruthless natural selection. Natural selection is merciless and eliminates everything that's not good. And so the good genotypes stay, and that's how natural selection works. And it has been a puzzle for a long time on how that can possibly produce our mental life, our consciousness, and including our morality. And there's sort of two schools on this. One is that automatically this leads to a nasty human nature, because the process itself is thoroughly competitive and nasty. And morality is not more than a veneer. It's a little crust, it's superficial. And this is the view that we have lived with at least from evolutionary biology for the last 3 decades. Last 3 decades, this is what we have heard, is that we are not naturally moral. If we are moral, it's more to impress others, but it is not our real nature. The other view is, of course, that natural selection has produced a social nature, intensely social nature in the primates and in many other animals, actually, and that includes moral tendencies, that's a sort of extension of it. And let me sort of lay out how these two views compare and who has defended them. Thomas Henry Huxley, also known as Darwin's bulldog, because he was the defender of Darwin's theories at his time, was a big proponent of what I call veneer theory, the theory that morality is not natural to us. And he considered morality a departure from nature and uniquely human. It could not have been produced by evolution. It was something that we came up with. And the metaphor that he used in his writing was that of a garden that is kept under control by a very hard-working gardener, because otherwise you get weeds and the whole thing gets out of control. And that's how he viewed human nature. Human nature is inherently bad and nasty, and we work very hard to keep it under control. Dawkins, with the selfish gene, of course, added to that. He's not the only one, there's many other biologists I could quote, but Dawkins in the selfish gene describes for one whole book how we are ruled by selfish gene, how the genes determine everything we do. We are sort of the slaves, we are the survival machines of those genes. And then in the last sentence, he basically tells us that those genes, we can have them under control if we want to. We alone on Earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. And so we can chuck all those genes out of the window and then lead a moral life. But it's only by going against our own nature. The most famous quote of this time period is by Michael Ghiselin, who said, "Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." And I think well, you laugh about it, but this is what I was raised on as a graduate student. This was hard-nosed evolutionary biology at the time, is that human altruism doesn't really exist. It's pure hypocrisy. So that's the view that was dominant over the last 3 decades, and I have always hated it, not because of what I know about people, although that would also do it probably, but of what I know about animals. I visualize it like this. If you have human nature, the veneer theories say that at the core it is very bad. And the other layers are not necessarily good. And then morality is this little crust on the outside. So this is the view that we have lived with, and it is presented as the Darwinian view, because of course Dawkins and people like that, they present themselves as Darwinian. But it's not Darwinian at all, because Charles Darwin didn't believe this at all. Darwin, a quote from Darwin, Darwin believed that morality is an extension of the social instincts, and that it evolved. He didn't know exactly how it would have evolved, but that's another issue. And so he said, any animal, whatever, endowed with well-marked social instincts, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual capacities are well developed. So he saw continuity between human and animal, and he saw morality as possibly an evolved characteristic of our species. He was very much influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, and so, for example, David Hume, Adam Smith were very prominent in Darwin's thinking. And David Hume has made an enormous comeback in neuroscience. I'm not going to go into neuroscience, but neuroscience tends to support this view now, and David Hume has become a very popular philosopher as a result. I'm going to talk more about animals now and leave you alone with this big debate, but this has been a very big debate, and at the moment the pendulum is swinging back to a view the real Darwinian view after 3 decades of hearing this sort of nonsense about us being naturally nasty and that's all we are. If you look at animals, and Darwin was very much aware of this, you can actually see sympathy and empathy fairly easily. Reading emotions, one of the more basic characteristics, this is an actual painting showing sympathy, and this is what psychologists would usually call emotional contagion. Emotional contagion very well developed in the social animals. If you think about the origin of empathy, mammals obviously have parental care very much linked to the female sex, because mammals lactate. There's no way you can have a well-developed system of parental care, including nursing, if there is not some sort of immediate responsiveness to the needs of very dependent young ones. So the origin of empathy is very likely in parental care, especially female parental care. And that's why I think we still see in society today male-female differences in empathy and male-female differences in autism. The very simple forms of connecting with others, I'll get to the more elaborate forms, but very simple ones are things like motor mimicry. We are very much in tune with our faces. For example, if someone smiles at us, the whole world smiles with you, you know, that sort of song. The immediate effect of facial expressions on our own facial expressions. And yawning is a very good example. I've seen once a lecture on animal yawning, and the whole audience, human audience, was yawning. And there's actually a little study on that, where they showed yawning videos to chimpanzees. You will see that here. You will see a chimpanzee in the field yawning, and then this video is shown to a chimpanzee in the lab. She's watching the video now. There's the yawn. So, motor mimicry. One of the sort of hardwired bases of empathy, definitely present in animals. Also scratching when someone else scratches, eating when someone else is eating. But much more sophisticated here, this is an experiment that we did. This is Lisa Parr, who did experiments where we showed on a video screen images to chimpanzees. This is a chimpanzee here that you can barely see, who has a joystick connected to that computer. And the chimpanzee can select images on the screen. And what Lisa did is show emotional. First of all, she did some sort of very simple matching to sample design, where you show a facial expression, and then the chimpanzee sees 2 facial expressions, has to pick which one is the similar one. This one is the similar one. And so which one has the same connotation, so to speak, in chimpanzee life. But then later she did an experiment which was much more elaborate, where she showed little videos of emotionally loaded scenes. And positive emotions would be depicted by showing, for example, an animal caretaker bringing fruit to them, which is very positive. And negative would be seeing the veterinarian with a dart gun, which they don't like at all. And that would be the negative. So she had positive and negative clips that she would show for a few seconds. And then she would show the chimpanzees, without training them on this particular problem, she would show them facial expressions, one being a facial expression, a play face, which they show under very pleasant circumstances, and the other one, a distress face, which they show when they are in a fight or something. So you could call this the happy face and this the sad face, and they match them automatically with the sort of emotional content of the video clips. So the chimpanzees are capable of, when they see a video clip, to evaluate it in terms of positive or negative, and to select the facial expression, automatically associate a certain facial expression with those situations. So not only do chimpanzees have empathy, I'll get to that, but they have a very sophisticated understanding of their own facial expressions in relation to emotional events. So matching states, which is usually called emotional contagion, I think is very widespread in the animal kingdom, certainly in social mammals. Dolphins, elephants very well known for this, dolphins also, the primates. Reading others' emotions, they're very good at this. And to classify emotional content, that has been only demonstrated in apes. So being in tune with others is extremely important for survival. So that's, I'm sure, the selection pressure. Let's say, take the simplest case. You are a bird, you're in a flock of birds on the ground, a predator comes in, all the birds take off at once. If you're not in tune with the rest, you're immune to what others do, so to speak. You're the one who's going to be stuck there and get eaten. So you'll be lunch as opposed to the rest. So you have to be, as an animal, constantly in tune with others, including with the states of others, not just the behavior of others, but also the states of others. So there's joint attention, very well developed in many animals. Used to be considered as something uniquely human. I don't know why, because even chickens have joint attention. But if you want a chicken who pecks at the ground at some place, all the other chickens run over there. If you've watched animals, you see that constantly. And so I don't know why anyone came up with that as a unique characteristic, but this is very typical in many primates, joint attention. Shared goals. This is just a picture I took out of my office window. I have an office that overlooks a group of chimpanzees, and they do all sorts of things all day. And here we had one adult female, who was moving a heavy drum, and this juvenile ran over and started helping her move the drum. And that requires being in tune with the behavior of the other, but also with the goals of the other. And at the end, they both sat on the drum, and were very pleased to have moved it. So, very highly cooperative. Another image that I can give you of this is a video. This is my office at the field station. These are the chimps that I usually see. And this is a little video of two chimps who are doing something that they're not supposed to do. They're trying to get to my office. So they're trying to jump to it. And they do it in a highly coordinated and cooperative fashion, which is only possible if you read the intentions of the others and are in tune with the goals of the other. So here you have a female who goes up to this drum. She makes sound, you cannot hear that, but she drums with something on the drum to get the attention of that other female, young female here. The other one comes over. Then they're going to do the springboarding, climb on top of each other. And they don't get there, which is good. But the intention, you can see, is that we're going to do this together, and they have this completely worked out. They have done this probably many times. If you jump together, you can get higher than when you jump alone. So this being in tune with others emotionally, but also with the goals and the intentions of others, is, I think, very common. It's also very common in cooperative hunters, such as wolves and killer whales and so on, because they rely on that. They have to be in tune with the intentions of others. So it has very high survival value, and chimpanzees are very cooperative in the field as well. I'm going to show you a little amusing video taken in the 1930s of cooperation among chimpanzees, and you see what I mean by being highly coordinated. So this was done at the Yerkes Primates, and you have two chimps who have been trained to pull ropes, and the ropes are attached to a very heavy box, and on the box is food. So you see how they are completely coordinated. It's very heavy. Now this is not even the most interesting part. The most interesting part comes after this. So now they have made one of the animals hungry, the other one is not hungry anymore. So only one of the two is motivated. Now it becomes more difficult. Now this one is the motivated one on the right. And now with signals, they do it with signals. Now he takes everything. Now, The interesting part here also, apart from the recruiting the others, which requires a full understanding of the function of the others in the cooperative task, is also that the other one is willing to work, even though he's not hungry. Just nice guy, I'll help you out and you can have the food. And so there's an element of altruism here. We've done many studies with capuchin monkeys on this particular issue. So we have capuchin monkeys who perform the same task. But it's an old task that was done long ago by Robert Yerkes and his people, and Robert Yerkes was a real pioneer of this sort of stuff. So you have joint attention, very common. You have joint action and shared goals in the primates. Now we're getting closer to the issue of empathy with consolation, so stress reduction after a conflict. And I've done many studies on reconciliation. I will not go particularly into that, but reconciliation is when, this is for example a picture of two chimpanzee males who have been in a fight. They have been screaming and yelling at each other, and after the fight one of the two holds out his hand to his partner. And about a second after I took the picture, they came together in the fork of the tree and they kissed and embraced each other there. That's called a reconciliation. And then they went to the ground and they groomed each other. And so reconciliation has been very well studied and is a process of reunion after a fight. Here you see a sequence, a male chimpanzee attacking a female, the female coming back to the male about a couple of minutes later. Then she offers a hand for a hand kiss to the male. That's where our hand kiss comes from. No, I'm just kidding. But it's a way of testing his mood, so to speak. And then they engage in a mouse-to-mouse kiss, which is the typical way that chimpanzees reconcile. And reconciliation has been discovered in the chimpanzee, I think largely because chimpanzees interact at the speed that we interact. We recognize their behavior very easily. We are slow primates compared to, let's say, a capuchin monkey or a rhesus monkey. But we have about the same speed as chimpanzees. So we recognize their behavior more easily, and of course their behavior patterns are very human-like. So reconciliation is defined as a friendly reunion between former opponents after a conflict. But what in the same sequence, I can show you the consolation, the same female goes to the oldest female of the group and complains to her. That's the sort of expression that she has. And then the old female taps her on the shoulder and calms her down. Now the old female is not an opponent, so this is not a reconciliation. This is what we call a consolation. And a consolation is defined as a friendly contact by an uninvolved third party directed at somebody else after a conflict. Consolation, very common in the apes. This is an adult male chimpanzee who has lost a big fight with another male, and a juvenile comes over and puts an arm around him. He's screaming. Very common in humans, very similar behavior. And the interesting thing is that it's limited to the apes and humans, as far as I know. So here you have some data on consolation. This is data, we took data right after fights. We look at who approaches the participants in the fight. And the hypothesis that we are testing in this particular case is that if these contacts have anything to do with alleviation of distress, they should be more aimed at the recipients of aggression than at the aggressors, and more at the recipients of serious aggression than mild aggression. That was all that we were testing in this particular case. And what we found indeed is that in the first 2 minutes after a fight, there's a lot of contact directed at the recipients of serious aggression, and there's much less contact directed at the aggressors themselves. And so that fit that idea. That doesn't necessarily prove that it's based on empathy, but that fit the whole idea of distress alleviation. And if you do the same study on monkeys, as you may know, chimpanzees are not monkeys. Chimpanzees are something else than monkeys, are apes. If you do the same study on, it has been done on 3 macaque species, on capuchin monkeys, on baboons, on langur monkeys, you find a flat line. You find absolutely nothing. So this is unique for the apes and humans. And I've been puzzled by that because there's only 2 major empirical differences that we have in the behavior of humans and apes on the one hand and monkeys on the other hand. And this is one of them. And it's very robust now. There's now a recent study that was done in Italy on a group of macaques where the investigators reasoned what is the condition under which you would absolutely expect empathy reactions or consolation reactions in macaques. is when a juvenile has been bitten by somebody, so has been really hurt, you would expect that the mother would provide some reassurance. They didn't find it. It doesn't exist. Now, a chimpanzee mother would immediately do that. She would not hesitate. First of all, she would not hesitate to defend her child against anybody, but she would also provide reassurance. And so I think apes are special. Apes are different from the monkeys in this regard. They adopt somebody else's perspective to some degree, and they have this consolation behavior tied into that. And so let me give you a few examples of what I would call higher levels of empathy, not just providing reassurance or helping somebody or adopting the mood of somebody else, which are important parts of the puzzle of empathy, but are still not the sort of empathy that we usually think of, where even somebody can describe over the phone a situation to me and I understand what is going on. So first of all, the strength of the response. The strength of the response is extremely high. This is Nadi Coates, who had a chimpanzee in Moscow very long ago. And she describes that this, and she did a lot of interesting facial studies and so on that chimpanzee. She describes that the only way, if Joni had escaped to the roof of a house, the only way to get him off the house was not to threaten him with anything, he would not come down for that, not to entice him with anything, such as bananas or whatever you could offer him, that would not do anything. The only way to get him down was if she would start sobbing and do as if she's hurt. He would race down from the house and run over to her and put an arm around her and try to console her. That was the way to get him. And so it shows that the empathy response is extremely strong. It's not some sort of little superficial thing. It's an extremely strong response in the chimpanzee. And it ties in with what I call targeted helping. Targeted helping are helping responses where you take the perspective of someone else. Now, the most famous case in recent years became Binti Jua, who is a gorilla who saved a little boy at the Brookfield Zoo who had fallen into her enclosure, and she brought the boy to safety to people who could attend to it. And Binti Jua became very famous, was mentioned in Clinton's speeches as we all should be more like Binti Jua, I suppose. And so this kind of helping responses or feeding someone who's hungry, this is active giving of food and so on. But let me give you two examples of these helping tendencies. Both of them are on bonobos. Bonobos, in my opinion, being the most empathic of all the apes. One of them is a blind female at the Milwaukee Zoo, a very old female who was introduced into that colony at the Milwaukee Zoo. And each time the caretakers would try to call her to come to a certain place in the building, she would get lost, the building having many corridors and many openings and so on. She was unable to follow the commands of the keepers. And after a couple of weeks of that, the oldest male of the group would go to that old female and take her by the hand and lead her to the place where the caretakers wanted her to be. Now that's what I mean with these higher levels of empathy, because that's not a trained response by that male. That's something he spontaneously did, probably understanding, maybe not understanding that she's blind, but probably understanding that she had trouble following these commands. So he understood the intentions of the caretakers, and he understood the handicap of the female, and he had a solution for that. And that's what I mean with these higher levels of helping. Another one in bonobos is a female at a zoo in the UK who, her name was Cooney, who had a bird fly against the glass of her enclosure, and the bird was stunned and wasn't moving anymore. So she picked up the bird and tried to get it to move, and it didn't. Then she took it to the highest tree outside of her enclosure and climbed to the top of the tree and wrapped her legs around the tree trunk so that she had her hands free. And she unfolded the wings of the bird and she sent it out like that. Didn't do much good for the bird. But the intention was to do something for the bird that is appropriate to a bird. Because obviously this another behavior would not have been appropriate for another bonobo. And so for her to take the position, so to speak, to put herself in the shoes of a bird, so to speak, and to think, what is best for a bird? These birds fly by the whole day, so she had experience with that. That's the sort of targeted helping. And targeted helping is very highly developed in the great apes. It's very common in the great apes. There's really no problem with that. And you see that basically all the time. And is, in my opinion, largely absent in the monkeys. And so there are three differences. The third one is mirror self-recognition. And mirror self-recognition, of course, is tested in human children, and they show it between 18 and 24 months with the Rouge test, they usually call it. And we know now that apes have that too, and that apes recognize themselves in the mirror, and you can do a mark test on the apes. And as opposed to monkeys who never get that connection that the mark is sitting on them, the apes inspect themselves, and they also spontaneously do. So if you look at the family tree from which we stem, the primate tree, these are the hominoids. We belong to the hominoids. There's very few species. There's only 4 great ape species in us. Humans, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. And the rest we call monkeys. Well, there's a category in between, but we won't get into that. Humans and apes, and the closest relatives that we have are bonobos and chimpanzees. And a little bit more distant is the gorilla, and a lot more distant is the orangutan, and then very distant are the monkeys. And so something must have happened in this point of our evolutionary history where mirror self-recognition, consolation, and targeted helping came up. Not that mirror self-recognition is necessarily in the field a very highly adaptive trait, but it must be tapping into something of self-awareness that arose at that point in time. And so I think these things are related, and as I said, consolation doesn't occur in the monkeys as far as we know, and there's very few other animals who have this. Now, the only 2 non-primates that, in my opinion, have targeted helping, and we also think they have consolation, are the dolphins and the elephants. And dolphins have recently been tested and found to have, I thought I had a picture of that, but I don't. But they have mirror self-recognition. And so dolphins follow the same sort of format of having these 3 things together. Elephants, I'm at the moment involved in a study on elephants, and we hope soon to have the answer on that. Elephants don't work with small mirrors, as you can imagine, so we have to have a very big mirror. People have tested them with small mirrors, and I think that's why they never found anything. So alleviation of distress of others occurs in the apes. Targeted helping and perspective taking, I think, occur in the apes. And so they have these higher levels of empathy. But empathy as a general phenomenon of being in tune with others and understanding the emotions of others, or at least responding to the emotions of others, is not limited to the apes. So since my theme here is not necessarily empathy, but is the evolution of morality in general, I'm going to say a few things about quid pro quo. Do I have enough time? Maybe not. How far am I in time?
You're nearing 30 minutes.
Nearing 30 minutes, okay. Because I think the 2 pillars of human morality are empathy and sympathy on the one hand, and reciprocity on the other hand. Our golden rule is basically a rule that very nicely unites the empathy aspect and the reciprocity aspect. And so I'm very interested in primate reciprocity. We do food sharing experiments. I'll show you one little clip here of a high-ranking male trying to get food from a lower-ranking female. When you provide chimpanzees with food, they don't operate on the basis of the hierarchy, which they do most of the other time. They operate on the basis of reciprocity, and so even the highest-ranking male has to beg for his food. And then the second currency we used in this particular study was grooming. So we compare those 2, and the study that we did is we measure grooming, who grooms whom for how long in the morning. Then we introduce food and see who shares food with whom, and we had 7,000 food interactions, and then we measure if one has an effect on the other. And what we found is that if A has groomed B, this increases the probability of B sharing food with A. And it has no effect on B sharing with anybody else, so it's not like a general change in the behavior of B, it's specific for the one who did the grooming. And this mechanism requires 2 things. It requires memory, requires that B remembers that A did some grooming over a couple of hours at least. And it requires that B has a positive inclination towards the one who did the grooming. And this positive inclination that then leads to food sharing, in humans we call that gratitude. So that B has some gratitude for what B received. And I see no reason to call it something else in chimpanzees, and I think chimpanzees have that entire exchange mechanism down. And finally, I want to say a study that we recently did with Sarah Brosnan on our capuchin monkeys on fairness, which relates to this whole issue of if you have cooperation, you have to share the payoffs. You will not have sustainable cooperation in a society if there is no sharing of the payoffs of collaboration. And so we looked at how sensitive capuchins are to equality, inequality in the payoffs. And so what Sarah did is she would give a pebble to a capuchin monkey, train it to give the pebble back, and then get a reward. And if you do that with cucumber pieces, as we do, they're perfectly happy to do that 25 times in a row. And then the variation was that we provided one capuchin monkey with the same system of exchange, and a neighbor who was sitting next to it would get grapes for the same exchange. Now, the preferences of my capuchins for food are perfectly correlated with the prices in the supermarket. So a grape is much better than a piece of cucumber, so this one got a much better deal for what we did. And here you see a little bit the setup. I'll show you a little video of it, but you see a capuchin monkey handing back a rock in an open hand, and the other one is watching. So that's the experiment. If you do that with both of them getting cucumber pieces, they reject 5% of the time, meaning 95% of the time they do these exchanges with us. They have no trouble with it, and they do them 25 times in a row without any problem. Now, if the neighbor gets grapes, the exchange behavior starts to fall apart, because 50% of the time they don't want to do it anymore. And not only that, the one who gets the cucumber gets agitated and throws the rocks out of the cage, throws the cucumber pieces out of the cage, and really doesn't want to do this anymore. And if you give the other one a grape without any effort, so you just hand the other one grapes, then the refusal rate goes up to 80%. So the capuchin monkeys are sensitive to what you get for your effort compared to what others get for their efforts, which is complex. And it's a very highly cooperative primate, and they have, just like chimpanzees, they have cooperative hunting in the field, for example. And so it makes sense that they are so complex. And it's of course a sort of resentment, but it is related to fairness. Because, just a very simple thing, when this study came out, it got a lot of attention, and we had an interview on NPR, and the guy who interviewed us on NPR, he did a very little experiment on his children, because this sort of stuff has not even been tested on children yet, even though I can tell you they will respond to it. So this guy on the radio, he showed his two sons, Jeff and Mike, or whatever the names were, and he said to Jeff in his own home, he said, if you bring these books upstairs, you get $1. So you hear him going upstairs and coming down and getting $1. And then he said, Mike, if you go upstairs and you bring these books there, you get 50 cents. And then you hear a long pause, and then the other one says, but that's not fair. And that's, of course, exactly the reaction you would expect in children, and that's the reaction we got in our monkeys, basically. So let me show you a little video of this experiment. The equity test, where both of them get cucumber. So this one gets cucumber there. This one is going to give a rock back. There it goes. Gets cucumber. These monkeys normally live in a group together, in a much larger group. So this one again, this one again. And you can do that many times in a row without any problems. Now you get the inequity. So here, this one gives a rock back, he gets a grape. That's good. This one gives the rock back, gets cucumber. Now let's see what happens. Oh, there it goes. So this one gives the rock back, gets a grape. This one gets cucumber. Now she drops the piece. Now it's here. Now look at what the other does. So now this one gives the rock. Now this one sits in the corner and doesn't want to do it anymore. No, doesn't want to work anymore. So this was featured as a sign of a sense of fairness in monkeys, even though I would always add it's a very egocentric sense of fairness. The one who had the grapes would never think, oh, I get all these grapes, let me give one to my neighbor. No, she would never do that. So it's a very egocentric, it's not a concern about fairness in general, which is what we usually associate with a sense of fairness. It's a very egocentric one, but I'm sure that's how the sense of fairness starts, also in humans, young humans. So to conclude my presentation, reciprocity, I think, is very well developed in the primates. Favors are being repaid, and we have also done many experiments with the capuchins on that regard. Primates care about reward division and about getting rewards in proportion to the effort that you put in. And Darwin was right. That's my main conclusion, is that we are natural moralists. I'm not saying that these monkeys or the chimpanzees, that they are moral beings in the sense that we are, but we would never have been able to develop the morality that we have without empathy and a sense of reciprocity. Without those two, you don't get anywhere. You cannot sync up morality cognitively. There needs to be certain emotional framework to be involved, and that framework we see in the other primates. And I thank all the people who work with me, and I thank you.